This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend. I've walked your snow-capped mountains.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Remember, today is the 5th of November, 2020, and this is episode 214.
I'm Scott Delanoboe.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we're not going to talk about the gunfire plot, which was the weirdest thing to celebrate. A Catholic terrorist trying to defeat a Protestant monarchy. I don't get Guy Fawkes Day and the British celebration of it at all, even though I live there. But it's a good excuse to set off fireworks. But what we will talk about today is the results of the US election and what they might mean for British Columbia and Canada, and what we might expect when our own province finally finishes counting votes here in BC, which starts tomorrow. Thank you to the 103 people who contribute to this podcast every month. Support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast, as always, is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's jump into our first segment, Biden time for the results. I think it's pretty clear at this point that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States, ending the 4-year reign of chaos and badness that has been Donald Trump's leadership, presidency. We haven't talked a lot about American politics on this podcast, primarily because we are a British Columbia politics podcast. But the first test episode we actually did when we just wanted to try out recording was right following, I think it was like the first or second debate between...
first debate between Clinton and Trump.
And then I think we did a couple other episodes in the early days that are still in the archives if you want to dig back. I think right after Trump won. Later we did one after Charlottesville. And we've talked about the US a couple times when it comes to trade chaos with Canada. But otherwise we mostly avoided it because I hear there are 1 or 2 other podcasts out there that cover American politics solely.
Just a couple. And also it's, I think, good that we haven't talked about it too much. Not only because it's not our niche, but overall, I think Canadians tend to be proportionally way more interested in American politics compared to Canadian politics than is necessarily healthy. And we have a tendency to try and apply American political lenses to things that aren't really that here in Canada. But I think this kind of the last couple days has, I think, reached the point where it is actually worth taking a look at what's happening down south and how that affects us up here.
It's also just all we've been able to pay attention to because it is so captivating, and nothing is happening provincially really since we're in this interregnum period until the votes are counted again tomorrow, and we know how much bigger the BC NDP government will be, and once they start sitting again.
Yeah,
otherwise it's just pandemic control.
Yeah, outside of work, I really have not been able to think about too much else since probably about 4:30 on Tuesday.
So like we said off the top, Joe Biden seems like he's got the only path left. They're still counting in Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona and Nevada technically, though those look like they're pretty safely in the Biden camp. Alaska's still technically counting, but it's pretty safely Republican at this point, except the Senate might be interesting there.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that's 8 o'clock p.m. Pacific time when we're recording this on Thursday, and a lot can change in the next couple of hours. Right now, there's about a 3,000 vote gap there. Pennsylvania's a lot larger, but there's a lot more votes coming in there. or left to come in. And Nevada is actually the place with the least amount reported in, but the way it's apparently broken down, it's safer to say that one is going to go Biden than a couple of the others we're waiting on the final counts on.
So Biden is saying he is pretty sure he can win. Trump is saying if you only count the legal valid votes, he's won, which is his way of trying to do what he told us he was going to do and discard mail-in ballots and anything that reject the results that don't favor him. But he looked pretty sad this afternoon, and I think he's starting to accept that he's not going to be president for much longer.
Yeah, and that's such a low bar, but it is helpful that a lot of kind of the GOP establishment don't seem to really be wanting to carry his water on this one.
Which is very good for the first thing that Canada won't have to deal with, which is the potential of open hostilities within the states between Trump supporters and
it reduces the odds of it. There's still it doesn't take too many people to send things into a bad place. So it's still possible, especially once the final results counted, but it is, I think, less likely that there is a long-term damage if any bits of spot violence were to erupt or that it would spread.
And that's good, just for America, but also as the neighbor to America, it's nice not to see a country with nuclear weapons descend into civil war. So do you want to turn our attention forward? Presuming Biden wins, the Democrats look set to hold the House. The Senate is still in question. It seems very narrow. There is a path to the Democrats taking the Senate, in which case they can actually do things. If they don't, there'll just be a lot of executive orders being overturned and maybe some legislation will move through. But what will this realistically mean for Canada?
So it's undoubtedly a good thing for Canada. Trump was very much a wild card in a lot of ways, and over the past 4 years has done a lot to undermine and weaken America's relationships, not just with us, but with a lot of its allies. And that has put Canada in a more precarious position. And Biden is much more of an international institutionalist and going to be a president that will seek to repair those relations. So that is good. On the other hand, I think the thing Canadians more or less everywhere were really looking for was the definitive repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. And that just did not happen. Trump's going to lose. There's going to be a several million vote difference overall, but it's going to be a fairly narrow loss. And yeah, things aren't going to get worse between us and the States over the next 4 years, but it's still concerning that Canada's future with our largest trading partner, closest ally, is so dependent on the whim of 100,000 Midwesterners. And that is something that ought to worry Canada quite a bit and the people governing Canada.
Yeah, the short term, Trudeau worked closely with Obama. I think Obama even endorsed Trudeau in the last election, which was a little weird. But Biden was vice president to Barack Obama, right? So undoubtedly Trudeau and Biden know each other and have worked at some level together. And so that will probably be an amicable relationship. And that's just good in terms of little things like not randomly ending up in trade wars with America. We might still have softwood lumber disputes and the kind of normal trade disputes we see, but it won't just randomly be tariffs being thrown on our aluminum and then we have to respond in kind because we're dealing with a bully. So that'll be nice.
Yeah, we're not going to get the random, it's 3:00 on a Wednesday and suddenly there's a new tariff coming in. That'll be good. But Biden isn't quite the free trader I think a lot of Canadians would like to see in the White House. He's been quite a long proponent of Buy America trade provisions in U.S. federal contracts and everything, which will no doubt be a source of tension going forward with a Biden White House. And maybe the relation's good enough, and maybe we've, over the past 4 years, developed such a good, it's effectively a lobbying organization in the United States that we can find or create a carve-out for ourselves on that. But it's not necessarily the case that things are going to get a lot looser on the border, or it'll be easier to do business with the U.S. absent the chaoticness. Yeah, besides the lack of chaoticness, I should say.
Yeah, and Biden has also been big on canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, and that's something that Alberta has been partially banking on. It's owned by TC Energy and the government of Alberta, so there'll be a hit there for the Kenney government trying to get that through, and that was something that Donald Trump was really trying to push through. That seems like it should have been easily foreseeable, and Alberta's steadfast inability to diversify its economy in any way just keeps coming to bite them in the ass. So
Are they going to target the war room at the White House now?
It came out today that the war room is independent of the Alberta government because the Alberta Auditor General slammed it as a horrible waste of money, surprisingly. Also, the Alberta government has like massive financial irregularities that the Auditor General was pointing out. So that's its own story. I'll try and find a link to throw in the show notes about that. But oil's not going to be going through that. Biden will start to do some stuff on the climate, probably not as much as would be ideal, but at least having a U.S. president who's not an active climate denier will be positive for both Canada and the world.
Yeah, agreed on that. But the actions we probably will see will be fairly limited, I think, in large part due to the makeup of the Senate and how that is going to be in tension with the White House being Republican versus Democrat. And that's where I think there could still be a fair bit of political instability on our southern border. So political scientists tend not to like presidential systems too much for the key reason that they tend to be a little unstable, in large part due to the fact that you have competing Democratic mandates. And when those mandates inevitably clash, that's the constitutional crises that arise from that can often spiral out in pretty bad ways, as both a legislature and a president can claim, to be acting in, the people's will.
Indeed. And the U.S. is triply cursed by having the president, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, who can all be, they can't all be different parties. They're only a two-party system, but they can all claim different levels of legitimacy. At least our Senate can't claim any legitimacy, democratically at least.
No, not at all. And more to the point, parliamentary systems, when you do hit those roadblocks, just tend to cause an election to be called, which will give resolution in one way or another.
Unless you're Britain and you pass some kind of weird fixed election date law that prevents you from falling.
Or you're Belgium, one of those two. But other than that, it tends to work pretty well.
Belgium just couldn't form a government. That's a different problem.
That is going to be a risk going ahead quite a bit. There's already talk of whether or not Biden could even confirm a cabinet or get any court appointments. And with the, let's call it what it is, stealing a Supreme Court seat by the Republicans, the political legitimacy of the Supreme Court is probably at its weakest state in 90 years or so. And all of that put together leaves a situation that has a system that's under a lot of stress. And if something happens to add just a little bit more, it could end up failing in a pretty spectacular way. And Biden might be the politician that is perhaps the least likely to try and blow up any political norm in the entire US. But even so, there will be a point where he has a breaking point on that. And I don't know, I'm actually worried that at some point in the next 4 years, the US ends up in a pretty bad constitutional crisis.
Yeah, it's sitting on this brink, right? There's 47.7% of Americans voted for Trump after this past 4 years. Almost 70 million people so far, and it will undoubtedly cross the 70 million mark to Biden's 73 million votes, or 74 roughly right now. It's a lot of people are still fine with this, and that's scary. And the thing that is also in my mind is, what does this mean for Canadian politics? There's the expression that Canada's politics is always like 10 years behind America's, but in the past several years, we have seen some politicians try to import elements of Trumpian rhetoric or Trumpian approaches to campaigns in Canada to different effects. I think the most blatant ones, the Maxime Berniers, the Kelly Leitches, were dramatic failures. But there's this Canadian exceptionalism out there that pretends that we're better than that and we won't let that happen here. But I'm not that optimistic.
Yeah, so I'm on 2 minds on this. One is that not only has politics become more nationalized, in a way it's become more internationalized, where other countries' politics increasingly resemble the US political divides. And I don't know if this is a case of trends that are just concurrent in multiple countries, or if it's a much more globalized media environment that's helping drive this. But there is undoubtedly, you can see the echoes of American politics in other countries quite a bit. So in that sense, I'm not too optimistic about that. On the other hand, Canada does have a much different political culture, and it hasn't really found root here. And I think at this point, almost every time we mention Kelly Leitch now, we might actually have to go back and explain who that is for people who haven't been following politics as long as we have, because it was a while ago and she just completely faded out of the national consciousness and the national political discourse. So it's hard to say. There doesn't seem to be a party that is particularly doing that, or doing it in the way that Trump did it in the States. The Conservative Party, the federal Conservative Party, is nowhere near that as a whole, even though if there's maybe a couple members that might lean that way. And Doug Ford's maybe the closest, but his coalition that he put together was much more of a kind of multi-ethnic, suburban, working class sort of coalition, which is a bit different than the Trump one and leads to different politics.
I think there's elements that will always be adopted. Some of the stronger rhetoric I've seen used to different levels in Canadian conservatism, the renewed focus and on China, but not just on China, but in very specific ways. China deserves criticism, but
yeah, I think the criticism of China is much more driven by the kind of change and hardening of China's own foreign policy and actions in the past 10 years.
And I think there is an element where you see Erin O'Toole adopting this renewed, and we'll have to dig into this at some point because it's fascinating, or this new focus on the working class and talking up unionization rates in Canada, which is very out of character for the Conservative Party of the last several decades. It's not clear what that will translate to in terms of policy, but that kind of trying to go after the blue-collar worker was a key part of the initial Trump appeal. That's not to say he's playing the Trump playbook, but there is a similarity, at least in the who should they go after to build a new coalition?
And that is what I was alluding to with some of kind of the global trends we're seeing here. Because, yes, I got that in Britain too, where over the past, election or two, some, long time, much more working class, but more rural ridings there that, were Labour strongholds, delivered pretty decisive Tory results. And that is just, I think, a trend that you're seeing everywhere, where you're getting much more kind of education polarization and urban-rural polarization, which puts a lot of the working class more in the Conservative coalition.
And this will be something to watch for, in particular, in the BC Liberal leadership race, which candidates, I'm not saying one's going to come forward and lie and be racist and all that bullshit of Trump, but which try to play a bit more of a populist approach versus which, I don't know, replay the Andrew Wilkinson playbook of being the intellectual conservative. There are different approaches there, and I don't know which will win, and I don't know which is the most successful way for the future of the center to go in British Columbia or nationally. But let's just end this segment on one thing that's probably a little bit more positive for here in BC. The closest governor is the governor of Washington, and Jay Inslee, the Democrat, got reelected there, unsurprisingly. I bring this up largely because Inslee and John Horgan both seem to have a pretty good relationship. I said on Canby Report discussing this that I think their bromance is second only to Horgan and Andrew Weaver's.
Yeah, perhaps. And with Weaver out of politics, I guess Horgan will be looking for a new bro.
And that camaraderie seems to work out well. There's been a lot of talk of building better trade relationships down the West Coast, making it easier to work between Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland in Oregon. And there's this constant, slow, over decades talk of this high-speed rail from Vancouver to Portland, and this doesn't get us further from that. Yeah, also, federally, having a Democrat in the White House maybe gives us a little bit better chance of having time change enacted.
Not just that, but also the Amtrak Joe is going to be the new president. If there's anyone out of everyone who ran in the primaries who was perhaps the most pro-train, it's Joe Biden. So we'll have to see if we can actually get any infrastructure spending through Congress. But who knows?
Remember when Trump was going to spend on infrastructure?
Pardon?
Remember when Trump was going to spend on infrastructure?
I was just going to make an infrastructure week joke. We never got infrastructure week, and perhaps we finally will. And that infrastructure may be high-speed rail from Vancouver to Portland.
I'd love to see it.
So before we close off this time, I just briefly want to circle back to a little bit of something what I said earlier in this about how Canada didn't see the decisive repudiation of Trumpism that we wanted, and how that ought to worry the governments of Canada and just Canadians in general. And there was a real possibility that a second Trump term would have ended up with NATO falling apart. And there's no guarantee that we won't get a more isolationist Republican who will win the next election in 4 years' time. And that is something that really ought to concern Canada. And yes, it's good that Trump is almost certainly going to be out of the White House. But I think Canada needs to start to seriously plan for how do we get to a point where we're just not as dependent on the U.S., either economically or, as importantly, for our own sovereignty. And there isn't an easy answer to this that you can just flip a switch. I mean, people have been talking about diversifying away from the U.S. for longer than I've been alive. And it isn't easy because they are just so large and right beside us. You're never going to escape the gravity of the U.S. economy and size. But perhaps we should be thinking about trying to at least change the difference in size between the two to be much more balanced and I think a long-term growth strategy for Canada that aims to, not be a tenth the size of America, but maybe half the size of America, would allow us to actually assert ourselves and be more independent just from the benefits of size. And it would also have benefits in terms of Canadian culture would probably be less American focused just because it's no longer just swamped by the cultural output of the US. And there's a lot of benefits to that. But overall, I have trouble seeing how we're not putting ourselves at further risk if we just assume that, okay, the bad times are over, we can push ahead with things and go back to life in 2015.
Yeah, I definitely think that's very reasonable. Like, for a long time, me and most people on the left have not been fans of the US foreign policy approach, and finding a different way to at least identify Canada on that front is worthwhile. And that does necessitate building different partnerships around the world. In addition to the trade and everything else going on, the US isn't a reliable partner. They never have been. They're out there for themselves. Sometimes that helps Canada, sometimes it doesn't.
And yeah, I think they've also been particularly unreliable and are increasingly moving in that direction compared to, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And that is something that ought to concern us quite a bit. And where I've often disagreed with the left in the position you've, just articulated there is I never really found the, okay, how do we get there portions particularly compelling. And that is the thing I think Canada needs to put a lot of thought into, because wanting to diversify and wanting to be able to strike a more independent foreign policy can't really happen as long as the current discrepancies between the two countries persist.
Mm-hmm. Lots more to dig into in future deep dives when politics is quieter and we need content.
Yes, make politics boring again, or at least boring for normies, not the people who listen to a podcast weekly. We want you guys to stick around. Well, let's move on to our second segment, the night before the other count. So I'm not sure if y'all remember this with everything else that's gone on the past week, but BC recently had an election that is actually not over yet. So on October 24th, we got the counts for the early in-person voting and the day of voting, but a whole lot of British Columbians voted by mail, including myself, and our ballots haven't been counted yet.
Yeah, there's some 600 and some thousand additional ballots to be counted between mail-in ballots and special absentee ballots, the kind that were dropped off at district electoral offices. No one is under the impression that this effectively 1/3 of all votes cast is going to significantly change the results. The gaps are so large in most constituencies that the Liberals stand no chance of forming government. The question is more around the margins, like how big is the majority? That counting begins tomorrow. Elections BC released an update that says they think they can actually do it in 3 days, so we might know it by Sunday, or at least 3 days. It might be early next week, but we'll know surprisingly quick, because I think I'd heard some estimates that it might take a couple weeks from when they started counting.
Yeah, so there were some reports that it was going to take a significant amount of time to count all the ballots and process them, in part due to the snap election not giving Elections BC time to set up everything that was needed for speedy processing on that. But it's good to hear that Elections BC thinks they actually have found a way around that, and we can get results within the next couple of days and finally start moving on to what happens after the election.
Yeah, so we'll be able to hopefully talk on next week's show what these final results are. But for curiosity's sake, because I can't help myself from trying to predict the future, I took the one poll I could find that had clear voting intentions for people who said they voted by mail. And that was the Ipsos poll done just before the election. They pegged the NDP as getting 57% of the vote in mail-in ballots to the Liberals 29 and the Greens 13, which is a significant jump in support for the NDP versus a significant drop for the Liberals versus the on-the-day voting. And so Elections BC also has a table of how many outstanding ballots are waiting to be counted in each constituency. Those numbers are subject to change a little bit based on how many more come in. But if you plug those two numbers together, you can get an estimate of how many votes are going to go to each party in each riding. That's making a lot of assumptions that those numbers are, number one, correct, and number two, uniform across the province, which are probably not true. But if they are, the NDP could pick up an additional 8 seats, which is more than I actually thought, or even more than that, because the Greens would also get wiped out in this situation because their numbers are not good on the Ipsos poll, and that's why I don't fully believe them. So the NDP would pick up Abbotsford Mission, Cowichan Valley from the Greens, Fraser Nicola, Kamloops North Thompson, Richmond North Centre, Saanich North and the Islands from the Greens, Surrey South, Surrey White Rock, Vancouver Langara, Vernon Monashee, and the Liberals would actually gain one in West Vancouver Sea to Sky, which I also don't think will quite flip, although that one's going to be close.
Yeah,
this would basically wipe the Liberals out of Metro Van, except for West Van Capilano and Andrew Wilkinson's Vancouver Kilchena riding. This is high water of what we could see change, I think.
Yeah, that does assume it's going to be fairly uniform. And so I've actually pulled up the crosstabs on this Ipsos one. And yeah, if you leave undecideds in, it only drops down to, or it's only 40% of NDP versus 30% of Liberals and 36% of Greens. So late deciders probably shift things quite a bit. In terms of regional split, it looks like the Vancouver Island actually has the highest percentage of mail-in ballots, and Southern Interior in the north has the lowest. So it's likely to be fairly impactful in Metro Vancouver, but not necessarily the case that you can assume more than half will, or more than half of mail-in ballots in Vancouver will split for the NDP.
The one thing that makes me a little more bullish on these numbers is watching the advanced votes come in the US and seeing how pro-Democrat they are. Now, it's not directly transferable, obviously, because I think there's less of a partisan divide. But I do think there is some evidence that the New Democrat voters were more likely to mail in than Liberals. So I think most polls did show that those are likely to be stronger for the NDP than we saw on the day.
To everyone's credit, nobody was going around trying to discourage mail-in ballots in this election. But nevertheless, there was indications in quite a few different ways that New Democrats were more likely to vote by mail. Yeah, I guess I'd come down where I'm not quite as bearish on the Liberals holding on to as many seats as they have on election night as you are, but there may be a couple that slip away from them.
Yeah, the NDP is currently at 55, could go as high as 65. The Liberals are at, 29, I believe, if I remember the numbers off my head, and could drop to 22, and the Greens are probably at as high as they can go at 3. And Adam Olsen has a substantial lead in Saanich North. I don't think he'll lose that.
I would be very surprised if the Greens lose one of their Vancouver Island seats due to mail-in ballots.
Furstenau's lead is not as big as Olsen's. I think the Greens have some strength in the mail-in ballots as well, because if they're your MLA, you were getting out to vote for them. So
yeah, it would not surprise me to see that the Greens do significantly or close any gaps in the mail-in votes quite a bit in the two ridings they have on the island.
So lots to watch for in that. Will definitely be interesting how that influences the potential BC Liberal leadership race, because if you're knocking out a couple more sitting MLAs like Michael Lee and Vancouver Langara, that makes it harder for him to justify a leadership bid if it's no longer a sitting MLA. Now, it doesn't preclude it entirely, but
yeah, especially the narrow loss like him or Jas Johal, who also was, at least on the election night count, was only down by a little bit, still enough to lose the seat, unless there's a very significant change in the mail-in ballots in that. But in that scenario, but you could also see them building a campaign around, I know what it takes to win. We just barely lost. If we can figure out how to speak to the Metro Vancouver parts of the province a bit better, we can come back and I'm the person to do it. I know what it takes to be successful, and I know why we weren't successful this time. There's a message that could work there, although I still think the biggest challenge is going to be whether or not the people who are going to make up the bulk of the voters in any leadership race will necessarily see things the same way, if it's going to skew a lot more towards the more rural parts of the base.
Definitely. Let's talk about the other bit of data we have from this week that's also a bit more substantive. Elections BC also released the third quarter fundraising data for the political parties. This is July 1st to September 30th, so pretty much just before, and I think the first little bit of the election call. I forget the exact date of the election call. We know now that the NDP were really excited to go into this election because they'd raised almost $2 million in that quarter to the Liberals 1.15 and the Greens 327,000. So they had a lot of money going in to this election. We talked regularly about the fundraising advantage the NDP had, but in this last quarter, it just started taking off relatively.
Yeah, it didn't stop them, though, from campaigning on we're the underdogs and the Liberals are flushed with cash, the party big money sort of thing. But yeah, I guess fats are never really a thing to get in the way of good political messaging.
So in terms of who was most reliant on big money in some way, if you break down the proportion of donors, the Liberals proportionately relied more on large donors. They had 1,200 donors give over $250 to about 5,000 give under $250. The NDP had 2,000 donors over $250 to 10,000 over under $250. So the NDP had a lot of small donors, still a good number of big donors, more than the Liberals, but proportionately they relied more on the small donors. The Greens were almost entirely small donors, 2,600 small donors and 270 over 250. So I think that's where they could say we weren't totally making stuff up, even though they
still
had
kind of
money.
Playing pretty fast and loose with reality on that.
It'll be interesting to see the fourth quarter fundraising data and to see how each party fared during the election. I know the Greens really talked up how much money they raised right after the debate, I believe it was, when Sonia Furstenau really started to catch people's attention. I imagine the NDP did quite well through this election and probably raised I would say a record-setting amount for an election, but given the finance rules and the fact they couldn't just take a couple big union checks, may not have been able to do as well as, say, 2017. So this sets up a dynamic where the NDP are both in a majority government and also have the most money going forward. Now, the first challenge for whoever runs for BC Liberal leadership race will be, how do you rebuild that membership base in a smaller donor fundraising manner to close these gaps?
Yes, it's definitely one of the key parts of any rebuilding strategy that the Liberals need to undertake. And sign of how not great things were in the party that this long after the new fundraising rules, they didn't really have a good system set up.
And overall, it looks like decent numbers for the Greens. Raising a third as much as the Liberals got does put them in a solid position. It would be nice, I'm sure, for them to have more money, and they're going to suffer probably the most from not getting the per vote subsidy. But they are still a force in BC, and they're not going anywhere. They can continue to pay their staff, I hope. Well, moving on to quick takes, the Armed Forces is launching a propaganda wing.
Possibly, maybe not if you listen to the Minister of Defense. So this was reported in the Ottawa Citizen on Monday, and it's quite an interesting story. So basically, the Canadian Forces is looking at setting up a unit or organization within its structure to deploy influence techniques both domestically and internationally. And that this is currently being worked out on how they'd approach it, but nothing has been officially authorized yet. And this is apparently also related to a story that I'd completely missed about how at some point on a training exercise, the Canadian Forces put out forged letters warning about wolves roaming around Nova Scotia.
This whole story is weird. So this propaganda wing is supposed to be within the public affairs branch of the military, but it reminds me of any time like you see a police department try to do public relations and it just comes off ham-fisted and somewhat embarrassing. Like they just don't get it in a way.
Yeah, knowing the CF, that this is not going to be a particularly effective outfit if it does get stood up and authorized.
They are talking about spending $1 million on this, though, to train their public affairs officers.
$1 million doesn't go all that far these days. So yeah, I have two minds on this one. So as we've seen over the past, particularly 4 years, is that state-run influence operations are an increasingly significant part of international conflicts and tensions, and particularly what are typically described as conflicts other than war. And as a state, you never really want to be in a position where other potentially antagonistic states are developing capacities that you lack or lack an effective counter to. And in that respect, I absolutely see why the Canadian Forces, looking at the evolving threat situation and landscape globally, decided that they need to look at establishing the ability to conduct influence operations. That makes a huge amount of sense on that front. Now, where I have trouble with this one is both, it's not entirely clear that there are going to be appropriate safeguards in this in terms of domestic use. And the article in the Ottawa Citizen was a little vague on that, but did flag that's an ongoing concern. And then there's also just how effective it is going to be. The military's public affairs operations, they're fine, but they're never ones that are particularly noted for their finesse or subtlety. And that is something this would require quite a bit of. So I'm a little skeptical that it's going to be particularly easy to actually develop this capacity, even if the government makes the decision to pursue it.
It was also quite interesting that this all got leaked. Clearly someone either saw this and didn't want it to proceed, or thought it was amusing, or just had a little loose lips, which, who knows, maybe we'll end up with another...
You know what they say, loose tweets sink fleets, so
there we go.
Button that up. Some other news out of Ottawa this week is related to the government's COVID response, and particularly the business supports they are needing to renew and develop the next iteration of. So this is Bill C9 that's currently working its way through Parliament. And it is, I think, largely fairly similar to the existing measures put in place. There are nevertheless some changes as well as some controversies related to that. So this bill would extend the federal wage subsidy until next summer, as well as not go for a previously planned decrease in the amount that was paying out to businesses, as well as it's also going to tweak some of the stuff around rent relief and change the way it supports businesses that are subject to local lockdowns.
Yeah, the Liberals managed to reach agreement with opposition parties on this because this is the kind of bill you don't want to spend too long. Everyone agrees the wage subsidy federally has been necessary to keep a number of businesses afloat, and none of the parties federally want to see hundreds, thousands of businesses go under. There's 344,000 businesses who've received money from this program. So it's valuable. Keeping it going is necessary, and we're definitely in a second wave, so very reasonable. Provinces are going to start locking down. That said, some of the people who received money were the political parties, and the Bloc is eager to try to stop the other political parties from getting money in this, and that's their pitch to amend it. Although I don't see how lucky they're going to be if the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP all used the wage subsidy previously, which is more than enough votes to keep that in there.
So if I recall, the Conservatives had promised they were going to pay back at some point, I think, what they'd taken in the wage subsidy. That may cause some difficulties with them, but there is, I think, very little chance that the NDP won't want to take the wage subsidy because they're not in great shape financially at the federal level. So that's already a bunch of votes there. And if the Liberals want to keep it in, don't think we'll have any trouble passing in that sense. But nevertheless, this is the sort of thing that generates a lot of hubbub because nobody likes to see politicians get paid, particularly out of public money. But I said this at the time when we were first talking about this back in the spring, is that if you buy the underlying theory of the wage subsidy that you don't want to see layoffs and you want to maintain relationships between employees and employers throughout the crisis so that when things do settle down, it's easier to restart things to no longer a bunch of people out of work. There's no reason that logic doesn't also apply to political staffers. At a policy level, it makes no sense to exclude political parties. It's pure politics, but it's also the type of pure politics that is particularly potent.
I think the bigger things to watch for, because the aid package is a necessary deal and should go forward, will be tomorrow the Parliamentary Budget Office is releasing an update on an estimate of how much deficit we can take on before it starts to become an issue. Those will be interesting numbers to discuss, as well as what, if any, fiscal update the federal government gives Parliament, because we haven't had a budget since early 2019. And it would be nice to know how much money the country has.
Yeah, it's typically governments deliver a budget within a year of getting elected, and that's not really the case this time.
They introduced one in early January, but that got, or
they were going to introduce one, but no, they never actually went as far as introducing and passing one. The last budget we had was before the last election.
So that'll be the key measure to look out for. Turning our attention, though, to another thing the Liberals introduced this week, they brought forward their proposed changes to the Broadcasting Act. The Liberals have been talking about how to regulate online content in some way to make sure that Netflix, for example, is treated fairly with CTV. This is a big thing that CTV cares a lot about. And what they've introduced are a bunch of changes that would allow the CRTC to regulate quote unquote online undertakings with some broad powers to the CRTC to essentially set what level who and what they would be paying. So they could tell Netflix to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to produce CanCon. Michael Geist, who I think both of us would turn to for expertise on these kind of internet topics, doesn't like it at all. He says it would create a CRTC-approved Netflix service, reduce customer choice, and result in less investment in Canadian culture.
So, I don't really know enough to weigh in on the less investment in Canadian culture, on the technical side of that. But the main criticism I have with this is that I don't think the government has really understood or gets how current content distribution is just fundamentally different than when CanCon rules were set. Everything is more or less on demand now, with the exception of old time radio, TV stuff where you, by definition, or that, where the underlying function of the system means you have to make direct trade-off choices in terms of what you offer. There's only one show can be shown at any one time, or one song played at any one time on traditional radio and TV. And that's just not the case with a service like Netflix or Amazon Prime or any of those. It's always up to the viewer to decide what they want. And you can put Canadian content on those services, but you can't make people watch them. And more to the point, having a certain percentage of that it's not the same as requiring every 1 in 5 hours or whatever it is of TV is Canadian content.
Yeah, the original broadcast regulations make some sense because you have a finite number of TV channels that can fit in the bandwidth of the electromagnetic spectrum that they go over the airwaves on. Same for radio. There's only so many radio stations. There's a finite supply. It's a public good because it's the air between us all. And so there's a reason to make sure there's some fairness in that. The internet doesn't face those restrictions, so just get out of the way. Like, I'm not generally make sure these Netflix and whatever are paying the sales tax, collecting the sales taxes they should be. Make sure they're paying the corporate taxes in Canada that they should be. Invest some of that if you want in subsidies to encourage film production in Canada. BC's got a great film industry because of those kind of subsidies and that approach. Ontario does as well. That's why you see a lot of Netflix shows filmed in Vancouver. That seems like it's working fine. This is vague and seems like it's going to create a lot of challenges, and also seems like it's being rushed as well. The Liberals are talking about getting this through early next year and having regulations out quickly after that.
Yeah, the fact is, like, right now, more American content or British content or whatever country's content on a streaming service does not mean less Canadian content. So in that sense, it's just different. And if Canada wants to see more Canadian content on there, maybe the shows that CBC owns the rights to should be on all the streaming services and we license to Netflix, Amazon Prime, non-exclusive licenses for very, competitive or very low costs on that. Just because if that's the concern, then we should just be pushing that content out anywhere. And Canada makes some good TV and some bad TV, but like the good stuff, your Letterkenny's, your Schitt's Creek, they can compete with the best of the American or British TV. So why not actually start pushing them out there rather than trying to have these like arbitrary rules that X percentage in the library has to be Canadian?
Just as long as our little podcast doesn't count as an online undertaking, that would just really.
I think we could get I think we qualify as CanCon, so we should.
Maybe we get money. I changed my view.
So finally, this week Trudeau found himself in a bit of hot water after some comments he made about free speech. So this comes in the aftermath of a terrorist attack in France where a person was killed over issues that I think most people would see as free speech related.
Yeah, a teacher in a French classroom showed the famous Charlie Hebdo comics of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson about freedom of expression. Somehow this extremist heard about it and decided to murder this person, which is abhorrent, and everyone condemns that unequivocally. Trudeau was asked about this, and then there was also another wave of attacks in Nice, I believe, in the last couple of days or in the last couple of weeks as well, also relating to similar issues. Trudeau was asked why he hadn't condemned this enough, and he did respond in French a couple of days ago saying he thinks it's important to continue defending freedom of expression, but he went on to say it's not unlimited and said that people in a respectful society such as ours must be aware of the impact of our words and actions on others. And I listened to the length of the quote on Canada Land Shortcuts today, and it was quite long. I don't speak enough French, but they did have someone who could translate it roughly. And I can see why people were frustrated at him because he equivocates. And I think he's trying to make 2 points. One is the legal point that, yes, we all have freedom of expression in Canada, but the second is a more moral, ethical point about don't be an asshole kind of point he's trying to make, which when you're talking about someone who was just beheaded for the things they said, just murdered, people being murdered, like the moral equivalency is not worth doing in that situation. The whole thing is exhausting a bit.
Yeah, the best case scenario is this is incredibly tactless and arguably worse than that. But yeah, the time to go actually is not in the days after someone has been killed over something that there should never have be violence over. And it's not the time to race to do a very complicated, this is the intricacies of Canadian speech law. It's about
we can point out
message of nobody should die over speech.
Yeah.
And anything that takes away from that ultimately undercuts that very important message.
Yeah. Like free speech in Canada is not unlimited. It's balanced against all of the other fundamental freedoms and equality rights in the Charter. No one freedom is above the others, and the courts have a long history of jurisprudence, but nowhere in that does it justify murdering someone.
Yeah, so I think this is probably part of a broader problem, or at least something I find quite irritating, is how free speech has become coded to different sides of the political spectrum in a way that is very unhelpful in a lot of ways. And if I was to take a guess at it, I would presume Trudeau was perhaps responding to the way capital F, capital S free speech sometimes gets talked about in the broader discourse in a way that is not particularly relevant to this situation anyway, and is ultimately, I think, does a bit to undermine the broader benefit or the broader principle of free speech, which is something that should absolutely be protected and maintained.
And I get where Trudeau was trying to bring up other issues about discrimination and that, because in situations like these attacks, there is another angle to the discussion beyond the free speech question, which is the Islam question, where the xenophobes and the Islamophobes will conflate the fundamentalist extremism displayed by those attackers with immigrants writ large. There's a big debate in France right now about a separatism bill, which is where they're trying to end the ghettoization, I guess, of French Muslims is what they're accusing it of. But it means things like you will not be able to, you could face jail time if you request a doctor of the same of the sex that they're not, or of a certain sex, because you have to just fit it. It's an assimilationist approach that they're trying to take. It's also the Law 21 stuff in Quebec, the quote unquote secularism law there, where a lot of these things are being conflated. And so I get why Trudeau wants to make sure that he differentiates, but he gets so ham-fisted and ham-mouthed in these situations that I think it just pisses everyone off.
Yeah, I definitely think pretty much everyone got pissed off at this in one way or another. I honestly just hope at some point in the next couple of years we reestablish an equilibrium on free speech that is significantly less polarized than it currently is. Because it's honestly something that shouldn't be polarizing at all.
Agreed. But here we are.
And maybe with Trump out of the White House, the energy that gets pumped into these sorts of culture war issues, sorts of things, gets ratcheted down a couple notches.
We can only dream so much. We can only dream so much.
And that has been Politicoast. Find links to everything we talked about at politicoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/Politicoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. Politicoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.